Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller, and welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. One of the top movies last year was Les Miserables, the story of a Frenchman 150 years ago who was put in prison for years for stealing a loaf of bread, and who was shunned by every respectable member of society once he was let out. You watch the movie and look down on those backward people. But Michelle Alexander reminds us that things are not much better today for hundreds of thousands of people who were in U.S. jails and now are out, particularly if they are African American. Alexander spoke magnificently at Yale University in their divinity school. We'll show you part of her talk today and in coming weeks. We begin with an effort by Code Pink, Jewish Voice for Peace, and other groups to counteract the warmongering lobby AIPAC. They demonstrated in Washington, D.C. in front of the AIPAC convention, while the politicians groveled inside.
Hassan, 27 days. Bilal, 77 days.
Mohammed Taj, 58 days.
Milan Abu Hussein, 27 days.
Ahmad Bani, 27 days. Akram Rikawi, 102 days.
What Israel wants, Israel gets.
At the same time they were demonstrating, Jewish Voice for Peace and Avaz.org spent $100,000 to place this ad all around D.C. train stations. They organized 30,000 people to make web messages and phone calls to Congress opposing the AIPAC program. AIPAC is demanding that Congress give Israel a blank check for any attack on Iran and permanent exclusion from any automatic budget cuts, present or future. It's not too late for you to call Congress on your own. Go to our website for the links. Now to Michelle Alexander, litigator, law school professor, and author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness.
It seems fitting that we would have this dialogue during Black History Month, a time when many of us, or I should say some of us in this nation, pause if only briefly to consider our nation's racial past, our racial present, and the possibilities for our collective future. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and so it seems more than appropriate for us to consider what is the meaning of emancipation, what is the meaning of freedom in this era of mass incarceration, a time when millions of people have been literally locked up, locked out, put in cages, held in bondage. This year also marks the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. It's been 50 years since Dr. King declared his famous "I have a dream" speech. I have a dream. It's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. So I think it's fair for us to pause and consider, what could this dream possibly mean for the millions, 65 million people in the United States today who now have criminal records, are branded criminals and felons, and who have been stripped of the very rights that were supposedly won in the civil rights movement, people who have been relegated to a permanent second-class status. These questions are profound and serious ones, and so I'm glad to see so many people here tonight acting on faith, on the faith that we collectively can rise to the challenge that this moment in our history presents. A wise woman once told me that, quote, "In life there are acts of great faith and acts of great foolishness, and sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between the two." And well, several years ago when I first began writing the book, I believed I was taking a great leap of faith. I was trusting that if people of faith and people of conscience had access to the facts, the data, the history about the drug war, the Get Tough movement, the myriad collateral consequences of criminal convictions, the endless legal barriers, supposed re-entry, that they would finally have the same awakening that I ultimately did. They would begin to see the connections between mass incarceration and slavery, and mass incarceration and Jim Crow. They would begin to see the necessity of bold, courageous action. Writing it would prove so much more difficult than I had ever imagined, and I started to think that maybe it wasn't really worth the effort. But Spirit was working in my life in ways that I could not fully understand. Every time that I told my husband that I was giving up on writing the book, you know, for real, honey, this time, seriously, not finishing it. Quite by coincidence, a letter would show up in the mail from a prisoner, begging me, literally begging me to finish the book. I had given a few media interviews while my work was in progress and had been talking about my thesis and the data that I was marshaling, and as I was giving these interviews, these letters would trickle in from prisoners and family members who had loved ones behind bars, thanking me for telling the truth and begging me to finish the book. One letter began, and I quote, "You're probably thinking about quitting, as I'm sure many people are telling you not to write this book, but do it anyway. Do it for those of us who no longer have a voice." So I now see that I would have been a fool not to finish. A movement to end mass incarceration is, in fact, emerging in the United States, and while my book may not have been the catalyst, it is becoming an important tool, a tool that would never have existed if I hadn't been willing to listen to Spirit whispering in my ear. I can see now that my prayers and the prayers of so many other folks in this era of mass incarceration are finally being answered. I've been doing a lot of traveling in recent months, meeting with advocates around the country, engaging with communities who say they've finally had enough, who are eager to wake up, get up, and take a stand. I've been meeting with some extraordinary people, people who have been moved by their own faith, by their own conscience and conviction, and are doing the hard work of consciousness raising and organizing in their communities. People like Susan Burton. I met Susan a few years ago, and she is what I call a stone catcher. So many people in our culture today are eager to throw stones. In the Bible, of course, there's a story of the woman who committed adultery, and a group of men gathered around her, prepared to stone her to death for her sin, for her crime. What did Jesus say? He said, "Let he who is without sin be the one to cast the first stone." And as each man considered his own sins, the stones dropped to the ground. Well, today we are a society that loves to throw stones. And Susan, she has not only just dropped her own stone, but she has run into the fray to catch the stones that are being hurled at others. Today, it's not enough to just drop your own stone and walk away. We must be willing to catch the stones that are literally raining down on the most vulnerable, and we must be willing to stand up to the stone throwers and disarm them. Susan Burton is doing precisely that. She knows what it feels like to be hit by stones. She herself cycled in and out of prison for more than 15 years due to a drug addiction. She succumbed to drug addiction after her 5-year-old son was run over by an LAPD police cruiser in the street. The LAPD was speeding down her street, South LA, ran over her 5-year-old boy. The LAPD offered no apology, no compensation, and Susan fell into a deep, deep grief. Now, if Susan had not been impoverished, if she had been middle or upper middle class and had a decent health care plan, she would have qualified, no doubt, for many, many hours of therapy. She would have likely been prescribed good legal drugs to help her cope with her severe depression and grief. But no, things were different for Susan. Having nowhere to turn, she became addicted to crack cocaine. And thus began her odyssey, cycling in and out of prison for 15 years, never being offered drug treatment, only offered one plea deal after another. Just take the deal. It's just 6 months rather than 5. No, just take the deal. It'll be just 6 years rather than 15. Just take the deal. She took one plea deal after another, every time released out onto the street, penniless, unable to find work, forced to check the box on employment applications, no housing, no drug treatment, cycling in and out of prison for 15 years until finally, by the grace of God, she was granted access to a private drug treatment facility and given a job. And when she became clean, she decided that she was going to devote the rest of her life to ensuring that no other woman would ever have to go through what she went through. And she began by going down to Skid Row, where women were being released off the prison bus, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of their belongings. In Los Angeles, women were being released off a prison bus onto just Skid Row. No support, nowhere to go. And she would meet these women who were strangers to her as they were coming off the bus. And she would say to them, "Come home with me. Just sleep on my couch. You could sleep on my floor. You don't have to turn to the streets tonight. You could just come home with me. I'll give you a safe place to sleep. I'll give you food. You don't have to turn to the streets. Just come home with me." Well, Susan now runs 5 safe homes for women in Los Angeles. She founded an organization called The New Way of Life. And she now provides employment services, housing, helps women get access to the drug treatment, helps them reunify with their children who are often taken from them, sometimes permanently. She is out there catching the stones as they are thrown, one after another. And beyond that, she is organizing formerly incarcerated people, the least of these, prisoners, organizing them for the restoration of their basic civil and human rights. Susan clearly has woken up. She's doing the hard work that so many of us have imagined might be done by someone else. When I meet people like Susan, I'm filled with hope. And I've been meeting lots of them, young people, old people, people behind bars, people in reentry centers, people in schools who are not just catching the stones that have been thrown, but are working to build a real movement, a movement to confront the stone throwers and to disarm them. What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. I've given a lot of thought over the years to how we managed to be lulled to sleep and become so indifferent to the suffering of millions. And the reasons are numerous, but among the most important, I think, are the perceptions and the images of great racial progress. Images that reinforce the sense that those who've been left behind, those who are stuck at the bottom, find themselves there for reasons that can be fairly described as their own fault. We hear a common narrative today, not only in mainstream media, but also in many churches, including black churches. If only black men would get it together and do right. Pull up their pants, stay in school, get a job, do right by their kids, be a man, be a real father, stay away from drugs, just act right. Then, none of this would be happening. This whole system of mass incarceration aimed at black folks wouldn't even be a problem if they would just act right. There is a sense among many black folks that sadly, we've just brought all of this on ourselves. And this perception allows waves and waves of shame and punitiveness to wash over our communities, waves that meet little resistance. And paradoxically, the election of Barack Obama, far from reflecting the liberation, the true liberation of black people in the United States, actually rationalizes, in some respects, our collective indifference to those who are locked up and locked out. You flick on the television set and there is President Barack Obama standing in the Rose Garden, looking handsome, dignified, and in charge. You flip the channel again and there is Michelle Obama, digging a garden in the backyard of the White House, not as a slave or a servant or as a maid, but as the First Lady. So if a black man can be president of the United States today, what is wrong with you, brother? In handcuffs on your way to jail. If Obama can make it be president of the United States, why can't you? What is wrong with you? Last week I was in Chicago, Obama's hometown, a place where most black boys have a far better chance of being shot dead in the streets before they're 21 than being elected to public office, much less president of the United States, a place where nearly 80% of working-age African-American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. men who comprise the growing undercaste, not class caste, a group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. And in this great city, Obama's hometown, this vast new racial undercaste has become normalized, just as it has in New Haven and countless cities throughout America. Occasionally, we may hear about the homicide rates in Chicago or New Orleans or New Haven, violence that spins out of control, not everywhere, but in certain communities, certain neighborhoods, certain spaces defined by race and class. 108 young people were killed in Chicago last year alone. Hundreds more were killed with scarcely any notice in the media, just another black man gunned down. Now, I'm grateful that we are having a national debate about gun control right now, and that for the moment at least, politicians and the media are paying attention to the deaths of black and brown school children, not just the white children killed by deranged mass murderers. But I am disturbed, deeply disturbed, that in this national debate about violence and gun control, there is little honest discussion about why some communities are war zones and others are not. For while I support gun control and background checks and all the rest, I want to be clear about that. I think we've got to admit that the reason that some communities are war zones and others are not doesn't have much to do with the number of guns in them. I live in a community that is very safe. I've come to learn that many of my white neighbors own guns. What makes my neighborhood safe and what makes many Chicago neighborhoods not has less to do with the number of guns than the numbers of good schools, the numbers of good jobs, the number of excellent opportunities for young people, the number of dreams that don't seem futile but can actually be realized. Those are the numbers that matter when it comes to violence, not simply the matter of guns. And in Obama's hometown, as in so many other cities and communities across America, a choice has been made. It's a deliberate choice, and it's a choice that's been made over and over again. Rather than build good schools, we've built high-tech prisons. Rather than create jobs, we have embarked on an unprecedented race to incarcerate that has left millions of Americans permanently locked up and locked out. William Julius Wilson has written an excellent book entitled When Work Disappears. He cites statistics showing that when you control for joblessness, in other words, when you compare white jobless men with black jobless men, the racial disparity in violent crime disappears. Men who are jobless, particularly chronically jobless, are more likely to be violent. Now, joblessness does not excuse violence by any means. It's not an excuse. And most people who are jobless are not violent. But the reality is, it's well established, is that when there are high levels of joblessness, particularly chronic joblessness, in communities of any color, there are also likely to be high rates of violence. But joblessness in our urban centers didn't just happen. Wilson describes the disappearance of work in urban communities across America over the last few decades due to industrialization, globalization, and technological advancement. As late as 1970, more than 70% of all black men working in Chicago and other major cities held blue-collar factory jobs. Almost overnight, those jobs vanished. By 1987, the industrial employment of black men had plummeted to 28%. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans, primarily black men, found themselves suddenly jobless, trapped in racially segregated, jobless ghettos, struggling, literally struggling for survival. Now, we could have responded to this extraordinary crisis, the economic collapse of poor communities of color, with an outpouring of care, compassion, and concern. We could have responded with economic stimulus packages, bailout programs. We could have responded with massive investments in schools so that these young people would have a chance of making the rough transition from an industrial economy to a service-based economy, an economy where a college degree really matters. We could have responded by investing in these communities with job training, economic investment, education. But we chose a different path, a path more familiar when it comes to matters of race. The path of exclusion, division, punitiveness, and despair. We ended the war on poverty, and we declared the war on drugs. Black men found themselves suddenly unnecessary to the functioning of the U.S. economy, no longer needed to pick cotton in the fields or labor in factories. Black men found themselves disposable, no longer necessary, and were rounded up in droves.
Rounded up in droves. They spent $1 trillion on the so-called war on drugs. And what have they achieved? Illegal drugs are no harder to get now than they were 20 years ago. But they did succeed in criminalizing a whole generation of black men. There are now the same amount of black men in prison, parole, and other parts of the justice system than there were black slaves in 1850. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.